Andy, hello, and welcome to the Truth Contract.
Hello, David. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. So, for our viewers and members, Dr. Andy Wakefield is a physician, author, and filmmaker. He graduated as a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1985 and was made a Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists in 2001. Andy has published over 150 original scientific articles, plus books, book chapters, and invited scientific commentaries. In the pursuit of links between childhood vaccines, intestinal inflammation, and neurological injury in children, he lost his job in the Department of Medicine at London's Royal Free Hospital, plus losing his country, his career, fellowships, and his medical license. Andy reinvented himself as a filmmaker. He's written 2 books, including the national bestseller Callous Disregard, now optioned for a feature film. Andy produced, directed, and co-wrote Vaxxed, From Cover-Up to Catastrophe, a CDC whistleblower story confirming the vaccine autism link, and one of the top US documentary features of 2016.
The present DTP vaccine is the safest that medical science can now provide.
Liar.
In 2020, Andy released 1986 The Act, a docudrama story of the corruption behind liability protection for vaccine manufacturers.
What have they got? Right, nothing is what they got.
Would you please identify this document for us? Please identify Exhibit 2 for me.
They've got stuff.
And most recently, Andy is the director of his first major narrative feature, Protocol 7, which I have to add, I watched a few weekends ago and loved it and recommend everyone else goes and watches it too. Andy, welcome to this conversation. Thank you very much for giving up some of your precious time to join us. I've got a whole bunch of questions that I would like us to go through, if that's all right with you.
I'll give it a try.
Thank you. So let's start off with the first one. You've spoken extensively over the years about your experience with the UK medical establishment following your 1998 MMR study. What do you see as the most significant flaw in how the system handles dissenting scientific voices?
Thank you. I suppose the key thing is, first of all, you should encourage dissent in science because that's where progress comes from. I think, consensus, scientific consensus is the death of science. Once we all agree on something, it is inherently wrong. So we need dissent. We need to encourage dissent. Whatever the political and commercial challenges it may pose, however it may rock the foundations of our medical belief systems, history has taught us that progress, real progress, dramatic progress comes from the dissenting voices who have no other motive than to progress the field, to make, in this case, the medical field, and to make things better for, again, in this case, children affected by a serious neurological injury in the case of autism. So I think the biggest problem that we face is one of the mindset of the establishment. Particularly, and I can talk about my own experience, and I can talk about vaccine safety science specifically to give some context to what I can say. And I want to just read you something, David, that really characterizes the mindset of the system and what scientists face when taking on the system. And that is this. This is from the American government. It's from the Federal Register. It's an official document. And it says this: any public doubt, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist, in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's health objectives. So science, dissenting science, whether or not well-founded, cannot be allowed to exist. So there you can immediately see the barrier that the dissenting scientist comes up against. It doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't matter whether what you say or what the parents say about what happened to their children has real substance. It cannot be allowed to exist. So how do you move forward in science with that kind of impenetrable roadblock? That really sets the objective. And then you have, and it's something that we've really learned from the COVID experience, is this: when Tony Fauci proclaimed that he was science, Tony Fauci, represented science. He said that scientists working in this field, that is the field of gain of function research, might say, as I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweigh the risks. So there you have an unelected individual, a scientist, a single person, taking a decision on behalf of 7 to 8 billion people globally. I believe, it is my belief, that it is worth the risk. Of course, it wasn't. It was absolutely catastrophic. Now it's been established beyond all reasonable doubt that this was a lab-generated virus through gain of function, and that the consequences were catastrophic globally. How can it be that an unelected official, a single individual, makes such a decision and has such control over all his subordinates, all of the other scientists in America, which he did, and he exerted and abused that control? That this is what we face. How will that change? How can science, real science, dissenting science, an alternative view, not only prevail in those circumstances, but even find a voice? That's changing. I found personally that, when I was in the clinic, I could help one child at a time, acknowledging the parent's story, investigating it, as was my professional and moral obligation. But I found that in order to reach a much wider audience, when everything else was taken away from me, filmmaking, telling the truth, telling the stories, the whistleblower stories that had come to me over the years, telling those through the medium of film. Social media changed things dramatically because it's now become the main source of news for the population. And dissenting voices are being heard. On, for example, in America, the Joe Rogan show, 10 million, an audience of 10 million people, far eclipsing that of the mainstream media that's owned by the pharmaceutical industry. And then, for example, the appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. to head of HHL, Health and Human Services, that will, I strongly believe, get answers to the question, do vaccines cause chronic inflammatory diseases, conditions like autism, ADD, ADHD? So I think that we are in a very unusual position, that it's come about through a sort of grassroots and a technological revolution, nothing to do with progress in our understanding of the application of science to this question, which was resisted and has been resisted forever. So we've kind of gone around the Faucis, we've gone around the David Salisburys in the UK, we've gone around the lies and distortion and the power of the pharmaceutical industry. And I do believe we'll get an answer. It's been a long time in coming, and a lot of children in my arena of medicine have suffered as a consequence. But I am confident that we will make great strides in the next decade.
Okay, I've got a question on that, but I think we might come to that a bit later. So thank you for that. From your perspective, how has the UK's medical system's reliance on pharmaceutical industry funding influenced the way research like your own is evaluated or suppressed?
It's a very interesting question because I can, again, from personal experience, I remember one day we were at the Royal Free Hospital, part of the University of London. I had a big research team. We were doing a lot of exciting research, particularly at that stage in the context of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis as a gastroenterologist. And the dean Harry Zuckerman called us all of the academics, all of the heads and of academic departments into the lecture theatre one day and said, "We have been told by the government that there will be no further funding for medical research except through the Medical Research Council, and that will be dramatically limited. And so it is up to you as researchers, if you are to survive, to go out and enter into what were called strategic alliances with the pharmaceutical industry in order to get your research funded." Moreover, the medical school then went on, through Harry Zuckerman, to enter into a strategic alliance with GlaxoSmithKline for what the medical school considered to be a huge sum of money, which to Glaxo was pocket change. It was nothing. But what it did is it gave GlaxoSmithKline, at least this was our understanding, it gave them first choice on anything, any discovery that came out of the academic units at the hospital, the medical school, whether they chose to exploit that or not, but it gave them the first option. So here was the problem, and this really goes to the heart of your question, is that now we were in a situation where academic research into medical diseases in the UK was done wholly at the behest of the pharmaceutical industry. They decided what research would get funded, but more importantly, they decided what research would not get funded. Now, clearly, vaccine safety research, which cast doubt upon the safety of one of their pet vaccines, MMR, was absolutely unacceptable and had to be stopped. And their power to influence this went beyond that. We had a new professor of medicine at the Royal Free, Professor Mark Pepys, even before he came to take up his position at the Royal Free. He had said, "I want Wakefield out." And he knew nothing about my science, but I did not know at the time that he was already in a strategic alliance with GlaxoSmithKline, doing business with them. And so he came and he was determined to shut down my work. And I said to him, he called me into his office and said, "I don't like what you're doing, and it forms no future, part of the future of my department." And I said, "Well, tell me, what have you read of my work? What are the science?" He said, "I don't need to." So there was this supposed scientist passing judgment on work that he had never actually read. It just hearsay. God, I don't know how he'd even come to that conclusion, other than pressure from people who were funding his research. That was my impression at the time. And so that was it. The program was killed. And so you can see how the power, the influence of pharma can potentially change the entire face, the entire landscape of medical research, what gets done and what doesn't get done. And clearly my work was not going to get done.
A few days ago, preparing for this conversation, I investigated the Medical Health Regulatory Authority, MHRA, in the UK, which my understanding is that's the sort of top regulatory authority, anything to do with medicine in the UK. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, it's the equivalent, I think, of the sort of the FDA in America.
Yes, and essentially, if the MHRA says this, that's what the NHS has to do. And they might go and say, "We'd like to do something else," but if the MHRA doesn't approve it, it doesn't happen. So I then looked into, well, where's the funding coming from of this regulatory authority? And over 80% of the funding comes from the very people that they're supposed to be protecting us from. And I just sort of did the maths at the back of an envelope and thought, it's pocket change, the amount of money that the pharmaceutical gives to this regulatory authority. And if they weren't allowed to give them any money at all, and the government, i.e. the taxpayer, had to pay it, you could imagine that vast savings could be made in the NHS deploying homeopathic or off-patent or other interventions that people have discovered work that have been silenced and shut down and not allowed to research because it was again. So is this not a classic agency capture story?
Absolutely, and it mirrors exactly what happened in the United States, where in 1986 they passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and that effectively exempted the the vaccine manufacturers from liability for death and injury caused by their vaccines that were on the CDC's recommended childhood schedule. And when they did that, and this is very similar to the situation in America, in the UK, in many ways, is that when they did that, they created the perfect business model for pharma. Because unlike the UK, it's mandatory for many states in the United States to have vaccination to attend school, for example, to attend public school. And so you had a mandatory market, you had no liability, all you could do was make a massive profit. And so they dramatically expanded the vaccine program to include many new vaccines that were of increasingly less and less value, but made them a great deal of money. And in doing so, they became very wealthy. And when they became very wealthy, they became very powerful. And then they bought the media. They bought advertising in the media. They bought the medical schools. They bought medical school training. They paid for doctors. They paid a fortune to co-opt doctors. They bought off the FDA and the CDC. And the CDC and the FDA said, oh, no, we don't get money. We're not allowed to take money from them. But these organizations, these governmental organizations, have charities. And those charities receive a huge amount of money. So that indirectly it was going from the pharmaceutical industry, almost laundering, if you like, to avoid this scrutiny of, well, no, we don't take money from the pharmaceutical. Yes, you do. And so just like the MHRA, they are heavily beholden to the pharmaceutical companies, the people that they're meant to regulate for their very survival. And of course, they're going to bend to the will of the vaccine manufacturers. Of course they are. So you have this extraordinary power in the hands of the very people that you're trying to regulate. And that's got to stop. That has really got to stop.
A very good friend of mine has developed a very safe, non-toxic colorectal early diagnosis solution. And it would save the National Health Service billions if this was used. And he's in a situation now where he needs £5 million to get the trials finished. And then he's already got the 15 million lined up from institutional investors, but they won't do this 5 million bit, but he's got the 15 million lined up for the next phase. And a sort of very positive, encouraging indication from the NHS that they would buy this because it would save them billions. I said to him, why don't you get the NHS to give you the 5 million if it's going to save them billions? And the answer was because the pharmaceutical industry wouldn't like that, and through the MHRA would prevent them funding that.
Yes, and of course, unless they were given first option of buying it at a knockdown price, yes. Yeah, this kind of influence we see, it's pervasive, whether it's in medical devices or in safe natural products, safe off-label products, safe products that have gone beyond patent expiry, and so that they're not of value to the pharmaceutical companies anymore, then they get actively suppressed, and this happens all the time.
I'm actually reading this book at the moment, which is called Follow the Money, which is a very interesting book all about the state of the British economy, where the government gets its money from and where it spends the money. And of course, the NHS is a giant recipient of, taxpayer funding. It's, billions and billions, hundreds of billions. And so it just seems to me that there are lots and lots of cheaper, perfectly safe other treatments that the NHS could give that would save billions of billions. But because the MRHA would appear to have been captured by the pharmaceutical industry, who really don't give it that much money at all, the taxpayer is spending hundreds of billions on things that it probably doesn't need to or could get done cheaper or safer. And this tiny organization, which is controlled by the biopharmaceutical industry, is costing the average UK taxpayer billions of pounds every year. So there's a sort of financial inequity of it all. And then you also worry about the safety and efficacy of the programs that or the interventions that they want to put into place.
Yes.
Because of course, healthy people don't make money for pharmaceutical companies.
No, keep people ill.
Wasn't there?
Lord,
I'll
God
get
forbid
on.
we cure disease.
So, my next question. You've claimed that the General Medical Council's decision to strike you off was more about silencing you than addressing evidence. What specific aspects of that process do you believe expose a broken system?
Well, let me deal with facts. At the time, the General Medical Council was under a lot of scrutiny at the time of my hearing with Professor Walker-Smith and Simon Murch. It was under a lot of scrutiny from the government because the government didn't feel they were doing a very good job. And since they're funded in large part by the government, they had to sort of bend to the will of the government. And this case, the case against me, was very much in the government's interest, that need to prevail and to have me struck off. And so the GMC was under huge pressure at the time to fall in line with government diktat in order to survive. Otherwise, their funding would have been cut, their power would have been reduced dramatically, and their ability to function would be handed over to the government, and the government would be regulating doctors. And so there was already a conflict of interests going into this issue. Perhaps the best example of how they handled the evidence and how were they fit to make judgment came when, at the end of the hearing, and we had our licenses taken away. All three of us were found guilty, and Professor Walker-Smith and I had our licenses removed. Professor Walker-Smith appealed. So did I. We appealed to the English High Court. We appealed for the first time we had access to it to a real judiciary, not the GMC, which was just a body of doctors who had no training in law at all. We appealed to the English High Court. And Professor Walker-Smith was funded to appeal. I was not. And my lawyers said to me, this is going to cost you up to £500,000 to appeal. And I hadn't got any money, so I had to withdraw my appeal. So justice belongs to those who can afford it. Why? Because when Walker-Smith appealed, the convictions against him were completely overturned. They were almost exclusively the same convictions against me, allegations against me. He was completely overturned by Justice Mitting in the English High Court. And he said, and he was incredibly critical of the GMC, said they were not fit to judge evidence and they were biased. And he just absolutely trashed their decision, their whole handling of the case. And he was completely exonerated. There was no protest, no appeal whatsoever on behalf of the General Medical Council by their barristers. They simply bowed their heads and walked out of the room. So there was no attempt to defend the position they'd taken or the way they'd executed their case against us. And it was thrown out. But unfortunately, my opportunity to appeal because of the funding issue meant that justice belong to those who can afford it. And that is the case. I'm afraid that is my experience of the law. Justice belongs to those who can afford it. And so that gives you a clear, factual, objective insight into the mishandling of this case, the deliberate mishandling of this case by the General Medical Council.
What year was that, Andy?
Well, it spanned a period, I think, from 2008 or 9 right the way through. It lasted. It was the longest lasting case in the history of the GMC, I think, at the time. Went through to 2011 or 12. I can't remember the precise dates.
But one of your colleagues who was dismissed at the same time as you had effectively funding covered for his appeal, and he won his appeal, but you didn't have the funding at the time to cover yours, and therefore couldn't benefit from him winning his appeal.
No, I'd had to withdraw my
Yeah, no,
appeal.
I understand. So lawfare at its best.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story. In your view, how has the UK's public health policy, particularly around vaccination, prioritized conformity over patient safety or individual choice?
Well, I think my first experience of this was part of what happened is because of the position I'd taken, David, people would come to me from industry or from regulatory agencies like the National Health Service and say, we've done a terrible thing and here is the evidence. And I became a repository for whistleblowers, and that was subsequently the basis of my filmmaking career. But at the time, I was contacted by lawyers who were representing Dr. Alistair Torres. And Dr. Alistair Torres was working with the Department of Health and was an expert in vaccines. And what had happened early on when MMR was introduced into the UK, it had already been introduced into Japan and to Canada in the form that we were anticipating using in the UK. And that specifically contained a mump strain of the vaccine, of the virus, that was called the Urabi AM9. Now, that was produced in Japan, and it was part of what was SmithKline Beecham's MMR vaccine at that time. So the Urabi AM9 mump strain. Well, in Japan and in Canada, it caused an unacceptable level of meningitis in children and was withdrawn. In the same month that it was withdrawn in Canada, completely known, all of this completely known to the UK authorities, and David Salisbury in particular, who was the doctor responsible for its introduction, it was withdrawn for causing meningitis. Alistair Torres went to Salisbury and to the chief medical officer at the time, Kenneth Calman, and said, do not introduce this vaccine. It is causing meningitis. It's being withdrawn in Japan. It's being withdrawn in Canada, and you cannot use it. But they decided that they were going to ignore that advice. Not in the interests of children. They acknowledged that it was causing meningitis. Not in the interests of children, but in the interests of pursuing the preferred policy, which may have been at the time the fact that this was the MMR vaccine produced by the home team, SmithKline Beecham, as opposed to the Merck version of the vaccine from America. And so they introduced this vaccine. It caused an unacceptable level of meningitis in British children. And only after 4 years, they were forced to do a study, what's called the Nottingham study, which confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that this vaccine was causing meningitis, and they withdrew it overnight. So there you have a classic example of where interested parties with a personal and professional interest in pushing one specific form of the vaccine ignored the advice of the from Japan and Canada and from their own inside source, Dr. Torres, ignored it and went ahead without any further safety studies and introduced that vaccine and caused meningitis in a lot of children. So there you have a classic example of the dangers of this kind of autonomy in decision making that pushes one preferred option over another, not in the interests of children and the safety of children, but in the interests of something completely different.
Is that something completely different? Money? Is it power? Is it control? Is it all of those things or none of those things?
You know, this is really a question I've always wanted to pose to them. You know, why do you do this? Why did you make this choice? Why did you make this decision? Was it money? Was it power? Was it control? I think it was elements of all of those. I don't think that there was bribery. I think there was an ideological mindset, which really comes back to that quote from the Federal Register in America that doubts about vaccine safety can't be allowed to exist. They can't be allowed to exist because they go against our belief, our fundamental belief that this is the best thing we've ever done. It's rather like antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The same sort of problem, and that is that when antibiotics were introduced, probably less than 100 years ago, they were perceived as being a miracle. And they were. In many ways, they were. At the time we had battlefield gangrene, neurosyphilis, scarlet fever, you had things that were major killers we couldn't treat, and antibiotics came along. And so they were a miracle. But miracles and nature do not stand still. Nature finds a way. Life finds a way. Great line from Jurassic Park. Life finds a way. And that's what it does. And what it does is to develop intrinsic systems or intrinsic properties that overcome the effectiveness of the antibiotic. And you develop these dangerous multi-resistant strains. And so in less than 100 years, we've come to what the British government now call the post-antibiotic apocalypse. The generation of these multi-resistant organisms that mean operating rooms, operating theatres, hospitals, hospital wards need to be closed down because they can't eradicate the infection. The same is happening with vaccines. So what may have been a miracle has not stood still. The organism has not stood still. Nature, biology does not stand still. It evolves, it develops, it evades immunity, it evades the protection conferred historically by antibiotics. And so we need to stay up with nature. We need to stay in many ways ahead of nature in our thinking, our anticipation of these events. But we didn't. We believed that. So it's now at the point with antibiotics where the industry is saying, look, we're not going to put any more money into antibiotic research because by the time we get these drugs to market, the bugs are already developed resistance. So that's where we are. So you're on your own, buddy. You're on your own. And we've underestimated the extraordinary power of nature to circumvent the problems that we put in its way. And I think that's what we're doing now with vaccines against viral diseases. We're dealing with increasingly resistant strains of viruses that have evolved not in spite of the vaccines we've been using, but because of the vaccines we've been using. And the danger here is that the plan moving forward is to use mRNA-based shots as the technology for generating vaccines against measles, mumps, rubella, and all those other things for which the current vaccines are increasingly failing.
Over the last 5 and a bit years, which is where I was first introduced to you, I've watched The High Wire every Thursday night in the UK, which you've probably been on 20 times in the last 5 years. And one of the charts that the presenter, Del Bigtree, regularly puts up is going back to sort of 1900 or before, the collapse of lots of diseases from polio to all sorts of different ones, when almost like 98% of all of them had been eradicated over a 40, 50-year period of time through improvements in sanitation and lots of other things. And then vaccines were introduced at the bottom of that curve. And then there's been an uptick ever since and so this is this concept of vaccine-induced disease, rather than a natural disease. And over the course of my lifetime, I think you and I are about the same age. I mean, I've had 40 or 50 vaccines over the years. I don't remember the ones I had when I was a kid at school. I've got the one where you've got the mark on your left arm. But because I've traveled a lot with my work and holidays and things over the years and been to lots of weird and wonderful countries, I've had lots of weird and wonderful jabs over the years. And to be honest, I've never had a negative side effect that maybe my arm hurt for half an hour after I had a jab. But one of the things that I've learned is that the way vaccines are made today isn't the same way that they were made when I maybe had them. And so to what extent is when people say, no, vaccines are safe and effective, they always have been, and they're one of the greatest, medical interventions ever. To what extent are vaccines made now in a different way than they were with the ones that I would have had over my lifetime?
Right, David, what I'd love to do is just talk about that graph briefly, if that's okay with you.
Yes, of course. I wish I could.
It's so important, and the public understanding of this is so important that it's absolutely right. If you go to Thomas McCowan's The Modern Rise of Population, you'll see this for the UK. You can go to the data to look at it similarly for the United States of America and other developed countries, is that up until 1920, measles was a major killer of children, in particular during epidemics. Beyond 1920, there was this precipitous fall in case fatality rate. It wasn't that the disease was going away, it's that the disease was becoming milder and milder and milder, and doing so over an extraordinarily abbreviated period of time. That by the time the vaccines were introduced, there had actually been a
Can I ask something? So was it just that the virus was getting less and less powerful? Or was it also that the human immune system was learning to deal with it as well?
Well, these things operate in tandem. And the first thing is that a successful parasite does not kill its host, because that means it can't spread from one to another. So parasites like measles tend to become more and more successful by becoming less and less harmful, so they can spread more effectively. An organism like Ebola, which kills you very quickly, doesn't spread. It stays confined to a particular area because it kills people so rapidly. So these infectious agents have a tendency to become milder over time so that they ensure their own survival.
Right.
So what you have is the host factors, such as improving sanitation, improving all of those elements like improved nutrition that lead to better immune function, diminishing intercurrent infections like tuberculosis that used to kill people with measles, these kinds of things. You have the virus-related factors, and then you have the mutual factors that allow the virus and the host to interact. So it's not a simple equation, it's complex, but it is, nonetheless, it's real, and it happens for infectious disease across the board. So in the early 1960s, they had a meeting at the National Institutes of Health, and they invited Sir Graham Wilson from the United Kingdom, who was at that time the world's leading authority on infectious disease, microbiology. And the question at that meeting was universal vaccination against measles, yes or no? And Sir Graham Wilson counseled against it. And he said, look, very, very few children die during epidemics of measles. The appropriate approach is to understand why that child died rather than entertain universal vaccination for the whole population. He said, we do not know the consequence of what we do. Are we going to alter the age at which people develop measles because the vaccine wears off? It doesn't produce lifelong immunity like natural infection? We do not know. So let us go very carefully. Let us treat this virus with the greatest of respect and ask the question, why did that child die and not the other
Mm-hmm.
900,000 children? We don't know. So, but the CDC said, no, we're going to do it and we're going to do it. It's not about death or disability. This is what they said. Now it's all about, oh, measles is a killer. At that time, the CDC said this is not about death or disability, but the quality of human life. Because we need to do it because we can do it. And what they were trying to do is emulate the perceived success of polio vaccine, I imagine, and they proceeded to do it, and it became obviously a worldwide phenomenon. But they were warned by the world's top microbiologists that tread very, very carefully. You do not know what you're doing, and there may be consequences that you cannot anticipate now because that's the way these things operate. And I would much rather we go after that one child and ask the question, why did they die or not? So the dramatic decline in measles fatality, making measles a milder and milder disease, had nothing to do with vaccines. And the question here, David, is if we had left alone, not introduced the vaccine, what would that curve have done? Would it have declined to zero very lightly, or just the occasional death? But we didn't, we interfered. And so it's not, you can't ascribe any of this benefit to vaccine. That's not what happened. So, and now we're in a very different world. We're in a sort of we're after the honeymoon period, as they call it in vaccinology, and we've got problems. So I can't remember the original question you asked me, David. Just remind me.
We're talking about the UK public health policy, particularly around vaccination, prioritise conformity over patient safety or individual choice.
Yeah, so I think that they had a dream and they executed on that dream, and now we are in a very difficult position. And it's no good blaming me or you or people who are trying to bring attention to these issues. They're very real. The public are not stupid. They treated the public as stupid. You know, that issue about the thing where they said, here we are, doubts cannot be allowed to exist in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will be continue to be used to the extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives. In other words, the public are stupid. We will make decisions on behalf of the public, and they can deal with the consequences without any liability protection at all if their child is killed or injured in some way. So I think that the authorities have made a terrible, terrible mistake. I think tragically, they've been extremely resistant to acknowledging that mistake in any way. It's been inevitable that they've had to acknowledge it in the context of COVID, because that's been such a disaster on every level, and now everybody knows about it. When I first got involved, David, 5 people in the world were prepared to talk about the thorny issue of vaccine safety. Now it's more than half the adult population of the world are saying, no, we don't trust you, we don't believe you, please don't try us, sell this one again because we don't believe it. And you've not been honest with you. We don't trust science, we don't trust doctors, we don't trust public health policymakers, we don't trust your vaccines, so please. And they have only got themselves to blame because they've not been honest with the public. The public are far smarter than they give them credit for, they give public credit for. And now we're seeing the backlash. So look to yourselves, ladies and gentlemen. Don't look to everybody else around you to blame. Look to yourselves and acknowledge that you've got us into this parlous situation and that we need now to take a very long-term view of our relationship with these infectious agents and their prevention.
What changes do you think are going to be required to rebuild trust between doctors and families, the National Health Service and patients? What do
I
you
think
think?
I can answer that from the doctor's perspective, and that is adhere to the fundamental rules of clinical medicine, that is to listen. To listen. And I'll give you an example. Listen to your patients, or in this case, in the case of autism, to the parents of your patients. To adhere to medicine's fundamental rule, and that is to listen. Not to assume in your arrogance that you know better than a mother knows her child. You don't. You've never seen that child before. The mother knows that child like no one else. And this is a visceral evolutionary imperative that, the mother understands when the child is well and ill, in non-verbal terms. They just know. And so please listen to the parents. Let me give you an example, and that is that I was presented by the parents with children who had been developmentally normal, absolutely normal, on every criteria of child development, and then they'd received a shot. They hadn't been anti-vaccine. They'd taken their children to be vaccinated on time. The child had regressed almost immediately and ended up with a diagnosis of autism or regressive autism. They had then noted that the child had simultaneous inflammatory bowel disease symptoms, diarrhea, bloating, pain, failure to thrive, all of the cardinal features of inflammatory bowel disease. That when they put the child on an exclusion diet of gluten and casein in particular, cow's milk protein, there was dramatic improvement in many cases that was sustained. The child recovered. They started using words they hadn't used for 5 years. They started sleeping at night. It was more than just a child being taken out of pain. And when I sat down with my colleagues in child psychiatry, psychology, the experts, the people who'd written the books that filled the libraries about this condition, oh no, that doesn't happen. This is genetic. Children don't regress. The parents thought they were saying complex words like helicopter, but they weren't really. They were just grunting and making noises. It's a genetic condition with which children are born. They're never right from the beginning. They certainly don't regress. They don't lose skills. They never recover. They don't have an associated bowel disease. Whatever you might think, whatever you see down the microscope, don't believe your eyes. And so the medical profession turned out to be wrong on every single count. Every single count. You could take those libraries of textbooks about autism written by the authorities and burn them to the ground, compared with the value of listening to one mother's story of what happened to her child. How much we could have learned if we had not been so arrogant. And they say, oh, we're just better at making the diagnosis. There's an epidemic. You say there's an epidemic, but we're actually just better at making the diagnosis. The best diagnosticians in clinical medicine were not of this century or the last century, but of the century before. People like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris at the Salpêtrière, working under him, Babinski, Gilles de la Tourette, all of these well-known people now. They were outstanding at describing human disease conditions. They could do nothing about treating them, but they were outstanding clinicians. And had autism existed, a fascinating, terrible condition, if it existed, they would have described it meticulously. It did not exist. We are seeing a genuine epidemic. So don't pretend to me that somehow you're better now at making the diagnosis. Oh, it's just milder cases. We're picking up milder cases. No, we're not. The great rise has been in the more severe cases, and this is data that's emerged from New Jersey and elsewhere. So these would not have been missed in the past. And this comes back to the original question, it reinforces the need for doctors not to assume they know better, but to listen and to learn and to act accordingly. And that has not happened. And it's not happened, at least in part, because with the vaccine connection, there's been this huge threat of, if you get involved in this, if you start publishing science linking the vaccine to autism, then you see that Wakefield guy, will exactly what happened to him is going to happen to you. And so the attack on me had two effects. One was that it shut me up, took me out of the equation, at least temporarily. And it also had a knock-on effect on my colleagues who might otherwise have pursued this. in private. My colleagues, certainly on my research team at the Royal Free, including the very eminent, most eminent of the doctors, said, we cannot be seen to question the safety of MMR vaccine. We know it's the MMR vaccine. We've written this letter to the government saying it can only be the MMR vaccine. But when it comes to acknowledging that in public, we're going to stay well away. Well, that's not the reason I went into medicine, I'm afraid. And didn't make me clever or brave. I just had an obligation. And that obligation was to the patient and the patient's family, not to the pharmaceutical industry, not to public health policymakers, not to the government, but to the patient.
It's very, thank you for sharing that story. It's very, I mean, up until, I'm not going to tell you the story, but up until 5 years ago, I had never had any reason to be interested in medicine. And there was a story about when I turned 60, I had a sort of male top to toe health check, blood test, stool test, urine test, CT scan, the whole lot. And they discovered a high level of mercury and aluminium in my system. So I went on a disgusting heavy metal detox diet for a year and protocol. And my 61st birthday was in January 2020. And I managed to get rid of 100% of all this toxic stuff. And I'd had some mercury fillings removed. And a few months later, COVID came out. And so the only naive question I had was, well, has it got mercury and aluminium in the jabs that they're warp speeding? Because if it has, I'm not going through that process again. It wasn't that I was an anti-vaxxer. I'd had 40 of the things, over the years. But I know when there was an incident at one of my children's schools, and we had a notice home saying that all the children were going to get vaccinated for some, I can't remember what it was for now. And I was like, I looked it up, and it's like, it came from a tiny region in the Congo. And I thought, well, A, my kids aren't going to the Congo. B, we're not planning to go in the school. So I asked the school, what's all this about? And they said, oh, we had a visit from a family from the Congo. And we discovered after they came, even though they didn't want to send their children here, that, so we thought it was best to make sure we got all the children vaccinated. And it's like, have you seen all of the side effects of this vaccine? My children are not being vaccinated with this ridiculous notion. And so anyway, I went to that, caused lots and lots of problems for me at the school. But I stuck to it. But I think now that, in the last 20, 30 years, my local GP and the local GP surgery, I'm sure, there's 3 or 4 of them. I'm sure they're all extremely nice people who genuinely care about people and doing the best they can. But I would imagine that their knowledge and understanding of COVID and COVID vaccines is less than 1% of my knowledge, having studied it through the highway the last 5 years. So then they're not to blame. I mean, you were a specialist in this, but the average GP doesn't get the training at all in this. They're following the manual, aren't they?
That's right. And what are we taught at medical school? And that's, what this is the schedule. This is the vaccine schedule. You don't get taught anything else, certainly nothing about side effects, other now than a lecture on that villain, Andy Wakefield, who committed fraud and did all of these things, which absolutely never happened. But it's the narrative that suits them. And so there is a lecture on, this is, again, a warning to you, young aspiring doctors, that this was what will happen if you entertain this sort of bizarre notion that vaccines may in fact be harmful in some children.
I, in the last year and a half, have been blessed with 2 grandchildren, one from each of my children. And of course, I've been terrified of them getting jabs. And one of the jabs that the babies get on day 1 or day 2 is for a sexually transmitted disease, mostly in homosexual people or drug addicts. And it's like, how can a 1-day-old baby possibly be at risk of, is it hepatitis B?
Hepatitis B. I just, sorry to interrupt, but you're absolutely, this drives me crazy. I say to parents, okay, let's just take the hepatitis B vaccine. It was intended, as you say, for prostitutes and intravenous drug abusers. What happened in the US, where it was introduced, is that they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't comply. They wouldn't turn up to have the vaccine. And so at the meeting of the regulatory meeting, the Merck representative turned up and said, we will not have an orphan vaccine. You will mandate this for infants. Infants aren't at risk of this condition. It's absolutely bizarre. And then you come to the safety studies. How long were the safety studies for this giving a child on the first day of life the hepatitis B vaccine containing the preservative thimerosal mercury? What were the safety studies? How long did they last? How long would a parent want to know that those safety studies were conducted for in order to be reassured that they
Don't
should?
tell me 5 days or something.
5 days, exactly that. People say when I ask them this question, 20 years, a lifetime, blah, blah. No, 5 days. 5 days was the maximum, and there were no controls, no age match controls, no comparisons. There was no science, none, zero science, and yet it was mandated for 1-day-old children. The consequences have been disastrous, and that's how the extent to which the industry appears to control policy making in this setting, and so you're absolutely right to be concerned. And when it was shown subsequently that children receiving that vaccine containing thimerosal had a 7-fold increased risk of autism over children getting that vaccine later or not getting it at all, then not getting it at all, in fact, that they hid those data, they destroyed them, they changed the documents and declared it safe. So it's fraud upon fraud upon fraud. It's an absolute disgrace. And this is what happened very much to me in the context of MMR vaccine. I said to the CDC, they said, well, look, Dr. Wakefield, every child gets MMR. Only some get autism. How do you explain that? Well, I said, I think it's pattern of exposure. I think it's age of exposure is one risk factor that you should look at. I believe, based upon the fact that measles early in life, under the age of 1, is more serious than when you get it as an older child when it's mild. And so does that pertain to the MMR vaccine as well? So they tested that hypothesis. They found it to be absolutely true, that the hypothesis was right, that I was right in this case, and that they then destroyed the documents, covered it up for 14 years, published a paper, a scientific paper exonerating the vaccine, committed blatant fraud that went right to the top of the CDC and were never held accountable for it. And we have it in their own words. We have it in their own words in Vaxxed, which I'm sure you've seen, but that was Vaxxed's story. It wasn't my opinion or Del Bigtree, my producer's opinion. It was straight from the mouth of the CDC researchers. So they committed fraud. Was there any repercussion for them? Was there any accountability? Absolutely not. So the system is terribly, terribly broken, and what it's going to take to repair it, well, that's a huge question.
I had prepared a couple of other questions, but because the way the conversation's gone, I'm going to go off-piste on a few, if that's all right with you. Looking at the UK medical system today, what do you believe is the single most urgent reform needed to address what you've just described as a broken system?
See, this is I've been thinking about this, and this is such a massive question, isn't it? I think historically and naively, I would have said we need to make changes from the top down, that we need to, the people coming into office, public office, need to adopt a very different approach to this. acknowledging the parents' stories, researching the parents' stories, reassuring parents, giving them back their confidence in policymakers, that doctors need to listen and in listening conduct the right kind of clinical science that leads parents to answers. But none of that's happening.
And if you don't mind me saying that, I'm sorry, that's a really naive
That
answer.
was a really naive answer. That was my view then,
Right,
when
because
I was younger.
during this conversation, we've talked about Tony Fauci saying he's the science and all the other stories. The system is so broken and it's controlled by a small number of people, all of whom have massive conflicts of interest with the medical industrial complex. So how on earth, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. This is not going to be a top-down solution because it
No, it's not.
sounds like all of the top-down people have all been captured and they know the science. And so, and the story you just shared a few minutes ago, 14 years burying the truth.
And so, David, I had over the years, I had the naivety kicked out of me, and I now come to the view that this is going to happen from the bottom up. That it can only happen when people realize how powerful they really are, how powerful their votes are collectively and individually, and how they should come together to force change. They've got plenty of information, plenty of evidence on which from which to articulate that change, given particularly our experience with COVID vaccine, given the epidemic of childhood developmental disorders, autism now in Northern Ireland, Scotland, 1 in 25, when it was 1 in 100, 1 in 10,000 when I was at medical school. So it has to happen from the bottom up. It has to come from the electorate saying, no, we've had enough. We don't believe you anymore. You're not acting in our best interest. This has been proven time and time again. And that's how we will affect change. And it also needs to happen. Sadly, it will happen because so many people will be damaged that it becomes self-evident. And people who will be damaged who are loved ones of prominent people. I talk now of the current president of the United States of America. And what that leads to is people like Bobby Kennedy Jr. getting into a position of power that allows him to do the things that he needs to do the science that he needs to do in order to affect the change. So two things are changing. One, sadly, is the sheer burden of disease caused by these, or at least I believe to be caused by many of these vaccines. And the second is the populace rising up and saying, no, we will vote for you only if you follow this particular mandate and do not subscribe to the interests of the pharmaceutical companies over and above our interests.
Well, that, Andy, is exactly why we've set the truth contract up. Because my way of explaining this is that people won't have watched the High Wire every week for the last 5 years, or maybe even be aware of your name or lots of the other doctors that I've watched on the show and read about and followed up with. And why should they? They're getting on with their lives. They would normally trust the local doctor and the NHS. But actually, they have this innate sense that there's something not right. And they have that innate sense because they use their ears and their eyes. And they notice that that person is having a COVID day off every other week or every week. And this person has to leave early or is always on medical leave, and that the company is not allowed to replace them because they haven't been fired or sacked or resigned. They've got to be supportive of these vaccine injured long COVID problems. Hundreds of entrepreneurs that I've spoken to over the last 2 years are telling me it's a nightmare in terms of productivity because people are ill, injured, sick, mental health problems, And the average person in the town where I live would say, oh, I know someone whose nephew had myocarditis and collapsed on the football pitch in the middle of a game, or so-and-so's granny didn't even make it home after she'd had her second booster shot. So people are aware that there's something not right. Now, they wouldn't understand it all in the same way that you would, or those of us who've gone down the rabbit holes the last 5 years, but they do sense that there's something wrong. However, there's another aspect of this, which is they're terrified of speaking out, because they know that anyone who criticizes the vaccine or their vaccine hesitancy is censored or deplatformed or demonetized or whatever. But I think, what we're trying to do is trying to get people to understand enough about this for them to say, that's bonkers, it doesn't add up, it should be stopped. And so what we're trying to do is support the people like you who are arguing at the top about what to do, to deliver 10 million voters in the UK over the next few years, say, this is bonkers, it should be stopped. And what we've got to do is educate people with conversations like this for them to say, I didn't know all that. And what I can now do is vote in favor of something. So I've got two final questions for you. So if the Truth Contract can get 10 million people to vote in a referendum for one new policy that would improve the medical health setup in the UK, what would the referendum question be that you would write?
Can you reassure us? Now, my issue is vaccination, so can you reassure us based upon science that there have been adequate long-term randomized controlled clinical trials of the safety of the current vaccine schedule comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated children? If you cannot, then you can no longer sustain the credibility of vaccines, because a pharmaceutical product is deemed unsafe until proven otherwise, until determined to be safe. And so that would be my question to them. And yeah, that would be, I think, my starting point.
No, I think it's a great question. And we will go away and do some work on polishing that, and I'll come back to you when I've polished it to see if it fits with what you've just said. But I completely agree. First of all, people don't know anything about this. They would assume that it's all been tested and all been through safety trials and all the rest of it. I mean, I've learned what a blind placebo, randomized control trial is over the last 5 years, but I assure you 5 years ago, I wouldn't have had a clue what it was, and neither would 98% of the average person on the streets in the UK. But we do need to help them understand that the assumption you've made, Mr. General Public, is that these things have all been thoroughly safety tested, and they are safe and they are effective. But sadly, they've never been properly tested and they're not safe and effective. So that belief that you've got, which you intuitively know you're right to question, we need to get to the bottom of this as we roll forwards. Can I please ask one supplementary question, which could be a follow-up conversation, if I can, for another day? One of the things that's terrifying me is, personally, and I know lots of my colleagues and other people around the world, is this mRNA technology. And so my understanding is that the COVID jabs were the first time that this mRNA technology had been used on such a massive global scale. That the safety trials that they did weren't done properly or for long enough, or they tested them against another vaccine for another thing, or it wasn't a blind placebo test. But this mRNA technology, if I've understood it correctly, changes my DNA. I've become a GMO. I've become a genetically modified organism. And some people, it might attack their ovaries or their liver or their kidney, or it might attack two or three of them. But this mRNA technology, which they tried for COVID, which clearly hasn't worked, is now being apparently rolled out into hundreds of other applications, diabetes and cancer and all sorts of other things. My gut feeling is that has to be paused at least, if not stopped altogether, until long-term safety data trials have been done, and that those safety trials have been overseen by people who have no vested conflict of interest in the outcome. So surely one of the things we've got to do is to also stop pharma funding of the regulatory agencies that are there to protect us, to make sure that the interventions which they approve really are safe and effective and not conflicted by big pharma interests.
Yes, it's my view, based upon the last 30 years, my experience in the vaccine field, is that mRNA shots, mRNA so-called vaccines, should be stopped now for all time. They should never, ever be entertained further. The technology that led to their generation, gain of function, should be stopped for all time. It is, we know not what we do. We're interfering with nature. We live in this laboratory mentality that doesn't see anything going on in the outside world, that anticipates that if we change one gene, it changes that gene and only that gene, when we now discover that it changes a multitude of genes and the whole functioning of the biome. So it has got to stop. Let me give you an example that the public will readily understand, and that is Jurassic Park. Crichton was a genius. The story was about the recreation of dangerous dinosaurs, ancient species that had died out millions of years ago, by taking their DNA and reconstructing it, repairing it with the DNA of frogs. Great idea. Create a park, people can come along, see the dinosaur, etc. Oh yes, how laudable. We could let, children with disabilities come on X day of the week, and then it was pointed out to them that the frogs that they were using, the frog DNA that they were using to repair the dinosaur DNA, came from frogs that were capable of switching gender. Well, the control that they put in place is that all of these dinosaurs were female, and therefore they couldn't reproduce in the wild and would therefore represent no danger to mankind. Big mistake. The inadvertent gain of function that they gave them was the frog DNA that allowed the dinosaurs to then switch sex, reproduce, and multiply in the wild. Big, big mistake. This was gain of function before it even had a name.
Yeah.
Crichton was an absolute genius. It led to catastrophic consequences. A lot of people got eaten as a result. But that was the point. And the Goldblum, that wonderful chaos theory mathematician, says, you don't understand. Life finds a way. And of course it found a way. And that's the lesson that we must take away from all of this, is that life finds a way. It will exact a price from us that we cannot even begin to anticipate now. So dabbling in genetic experiments to alter the human genomes, that's what they're doing. It's catastrophic, and it should stop now and for all time.
Andy, I think that's a great place to park this conversation. I completely agree with you. I can't thank you enough for responding to me when I contacted you about having this conversation. I'm so grateful to you. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to connect with you, having seen you on my High Wire show so many times over the last 5 years. You've been through one of my mantras in life is failure isn't falling down, it's staying down. And I've often quoted you in the last few years of someone who was hijacked by the system, punished by the system for trying to tell the truth, but you stood up, picked yourself up, dusted yourself down, and reinvented yourself. And Vaxxed and that whole series was wonderful. Protocol 7's fantastic, and looking forward to whatever else you produce next. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for explaining it all in a way that hopefully the average Joe like me can understand and go away. And we will work on that referendum idea, and I'll come back and run it past you before we publish it.
David, thank you very much. Great pleasure. Bye-bye.